Our next speaker is Gavin Matthew. Gavin is the Chief Executive Officer of the EWPAA. Gavin has over 25 years of diverse forest product industry experience in policy, development and advocacy, natural resource management, consulting, wood processing, and manufacturing. Thank you, Gavin.
All right, thanks, Benoit, and thanks everyone for being here and listening to me speak. Look, I'm not an engineer. I'm not an LCA practitioner. I'm a forester. There's a couple in the room as well. But what I do understand is business and what drives it. And whatever good ideas we're going to come up with later today, I urge you to think about the commercial benefit and the value that will lead to adoption in industry. I just pick up on one of Rihanna's points around landfill costs. That drives that process. And we think it's a great idea, recycling, etc., but you do need to have commercial imperatives to bring it in. So whatever ideas we come up with today, let's just put a veneer of what's the value and how is industry going to adopt it. So that's the first thing. Our big challenge, Australia's big building challenge. So I've got a few stats here and a few reports that define that issue. So a 2024 study by Infrastructure Australia found that buildings and infrastructure are directly responsible for about 30% of Australia's total carbon emissions. So around 30%. Data from the Federal Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, I think a couple of the reps are online, show buildings account for about 19% of total energy use and 18% of direct carbon emissions in Australia. Globally, the built environment is responsible for around 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions from the 2022 Global Status Reports, UN, and also a relatively recent report from the Green Building Council Australia indicates that embodied carbon made up 16% of Australia's built environment emissions in 2019. And without intervention, because if we start to deal with all the operational emissions, we're going to end up with embodied carbon being an even bigger part of that pie. So that's the building challenge that we're trying to do, is address those embodied carbon issues. It's plain to see we need to get emissions reduction in both embodied and operational emissions in the built environment. The government wants it to happen to meet their ambitious climate change and housing targets. So being the target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 43% below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050 are the climate change targets. And also the government has a 1.2 million new homes over 5 years from 2024. So they're big targets, and obviously the built environment's an important place to get those emissions reduction. And it's been difficult to get, as the government knows. So it makes business, social and environmental sense. It's not a nice to have, it's a must do in their minds. So how are these new houses going to be built? And the material used is hugely important, with lightweight timber framing and mass timber solutions being maximised to reduce emissions. And I should have advanced the slide, because there it is there. All right, let's move on. I thought it'd be useful just to, everyone knows it, but it's a useful conversation to say, that's our timber product supply chain. Obviously, it's even more diverse than that. It looks like one of those spaghetti diagrams, but everything is interrelated. It starts all the way back as we know, back in the commercial forests and plantations as well. It moves through sawmills, plywood mills, particle board MDF plants, directly or indirectly through those mills as well, with wastes and residues, etc. Then products move on to LVL, I-joist plants or CLT, glulam plants, and then into frame and truss manufacturers, joinery, furniture, windows, doors, etc., and then into the built environment. So it's a long, diverse supply chain. Lots of our business is both an additive business and a subtractive business. So we're disassembling trees and logs to produce products. We're also adding products together that we've either peeled or cut to produce other products. There's waste, as Penny's going to be talking about a bit later on as well. So we've got to, what do we do with our waste? Do we reuse it? Do we recycle it? Do we burn it? I'll put it in landfill, as we saw before. So it's a complex and interrelated supply chain. And obviously all the way along there are opportunities to add emissions or take emissions away. So I think that all those kind of things need to shape the way that we think about decarbonisation in our industry. So just a few, Rihanna went through some of these as well, but a few definitions: embodied, upfront and operational carbon, and I'll talk to it later on, but Rihanna's 100% right. Definitions of these types of things and carbon literacy is pretty patchy across consumers, across industry, across pretty much anyone, to be honest. Operational carbon are obviously the emissions produced during the day-to-day use of a building, including heating, cooling, and lighting. So that diagram at the bottom, hopefully you can see it, there's a nice little description of supply chain and then these types of carbon. Embodied carbon are the emissions carbon footprint associated with the life cycle of the building, including materials, construction processes, end of life. Upfront carbon is the emissions generated during the initial stages of the building's life, including materials sourcing, manufacturing, transportation, and construction. Now, strategies to reduce emissions in the built environment has been previously focused on operational emissions, but we obviously need to extend it to include embodied carbon. We would say with an initial focus on upfront carbon and then enabling to a circular economy. Different products across the building industry have different advantages or disadvantages in each of those stages. So it's always an interesting conversation with other building products about which ones we should be looking at and which one should be dealt with first. All right. Now onto what I wanted to talk about. We have a bunch of these over there, the report, and it's steps towards a greener future. So this report was released in mid-2024. I'll go into who produced it a little bit later, but I feel, and we feel as a group, that it needs more exposure. So there's a heap of good things in there. It's almost too many things, which might be a bit of a problem about how to communicate it, but it's a really good report. So I thought today that we could go through and just look at some of the aspects of it. So it's trying to identify opportunities to reduce emissions in the built environment using low emission products and construction practices. It was commissioned by the Gippsland Forestry Hub, Frame and Truss Manufacturers Association of Australia, and Kirsten's right in front of us as well, and also the Federal Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. Kirsten, if I get any of this wrong, just yell out. So a report was prepared by Wood Products Victoria with assistance from ThinkStep, ANZ, and also Industry Edge, which are two, I think, some of the best consultancy firm in this area in Australia. Now, Wood Products Victoria, I should put my hand up. I'm a director of Wood Products Victoria, and also Kirsten is as well. And I'm not just promoting this because I'm a director of the Wood Products Victoria. I actually really do think it's a good publication. Alistair Woodard was the project leader and LCA's expert, well known by pretty much everyone here, I'm sure. He retired early in the year, but I really wanted to recognise his contribution. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the types of reports and information he's given to industry over the years. Kudos to Alistair, and yeah, we haven't lost him. He always pops up and he continually emails me, and so it's good. Now, as I said, there's plenty of ideas, and I encourage you to read it. Let's go through this report a little bit. I think there's some things here that could help our thinking later on. All right, so the recommendations for action, I'm not going to go through all of them. As I said, there's a whole bunch of them, but there's 4 key sort of pillars. So government policy, voluntary initiatives, wood products industry actions, and then education of wood's value. So I've circled the ones I'm going to go through, and we'll trundle through, and hopefully it all makes sense. So the first one, government action. So all levels of government can lead and use their considerable building demand and procurement policies to reward embodied carbon reductions. As we were talking about these, even if it makes sense, you've got a passion for it, you need leadership, you need the right settings and government and demand as well. Maybe exemplar projects that kick these changes off, and the government's set to lead that process. I'll talk about wood encouragement policies, programs in a second, but examples of potential government actions were included in a recent CFC report, and I've got a picture of that later on, but encourage the use of low embodied materials and products for grants, etc. Use tendering criteria that evaluate and reward low carbon product selection in projects. Require embodied carbon to be measured and reported. We'll talk about it a few times, but if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't basically adopt it in many ways. So EPDs, all that kind of stuff is part of it. And also be consistent across government departments was another recommendation from the CFC report. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, if people don't know what that one is. So moving along, wood policy, encouragement policy. So this is not a new thing. There's around, and it's taken up by all levels of government, obviously state governments, local councils around Australia. There's a few, Western Australia and Tasmania has one, and 18 local councils. In our mind, the wood encouragement policies, they generally require responsibly sourced wood to be considered when designing a new project. So it's not a you have to, it's a you need to consider. And that's the approach that's been taken. And we've been encouraging more and more councils and state governments to continue to do that with their government buildings. Makes a lot of sense. All right. So EPD's recommendation 2.5 in the Greener Future document is support manufacturing sectors to transition and develop environmental product declarations to better understand and disclose the embodied carbon of the materials and the products. As I said, in short, if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it or compare it with other alternatives. So hugely important, but also quite complex documents, as we know, and especially they deal with more than just carbon and emissions, water, etc. Other environmental measures get described in EPDs. And I'll be honest, quite expensive to do, and at the moment, and also you need to be renewed at routine timeframes. So it can be there's some blockages in adopting EPDs or producing them, the cost and also the effort to gather that much data, especially from smaller companies or smaller industries, etc. So they're independently verified, registered documents that communicate transparent and comparable data about life cycle environmental impacts of a product. Most use it for carbon, but obviously, as I said, there's a bunch of other measures that are in those documents as well. EPDs are increasingly recognised in various rating schemes, such as NABERS, Green Star buildings, and infrastructure sustainability. Yes, standards reporting, like Rhiannon said as well, hugely important. The database on EPD Australasia is important as well and recognised by NABERS. So having consistent EPDs internationally as well as nationally to be able to compare those alternative products is hugely important. Moving on. New plantations. I won't steal any of Joe's thunder, I hope, but we saw that supply chain priming the pump with new plantations and new fibre into our timber industry, hugely important. And one of the recommendations of the paper, the report, was obviously to pursue incentives to encourage new plantation establishment. So it is widely known that the existing area of commercial for-harvest plantations in Australia currently insufficient and is not growing at an effective rate to meet current and future demand for wood products. Harrison described how plantations that are built near growing cities under pressure from housing, etc. There's a whole bunch of constraints about where you can plant, how you can plant, land cost, etc. So it's an area that's I suppose problematic to actually get those plantations in the ground. So we need some solutions along those lines. We all know that trees are renewable, store carbon long term, produce low carbon products we will need in the future. Obviously, we need to plant more. And all that we're going to talk about at the other end in terms of building industry needs this front end to be more fibre in the front end and more renewable, sustainable fibre where it counts to minimise those transport costs, etc. So governments can support, incentivise investors to establish more plantations and specifically for renewable building products. Now, the key is always to get those incentives right. I'm sure Joe will be able to explain more about it as well. So next one is around fossil fuel emissions. Pretty obvious, most people in the room would know about it as well. So our supply chain, the management of plantations, processing logs into wood products, etc., requires the use of energy. Some of that energy is from fossil fuel. Others, fortunately, in our industry is biogenic, so residues can be used for heat, and energy can be electricity, industrial heat, or transport fuels and those kind of things. So we should think about more broadly what our energy needs are in industry. Now, our industry needs to develop and implement decarbonisation activities to reduce or eliminate the use of fossil fuel carbon in our supply chain. And many people probably don't think we do, but there is, especially for renewable heat, industrial heat, we do use a lot of those internal wood waste, etc., to power our kilns and boilers. All right. Thought I'd put this diagram in. It's out of the report as well, but it's a good way of looking at those areas to reduce emissions. But to be honest, in many cases, it's difficult to effectively apply these principles. At the start of it, the build nothing part. It makes sense in your head, but obviously we need to live somewhere, and the stock of housing, etc., gets older and it's changing, and needs change as well. Build less, build clever. I think there's probably far more mileage in that area. I suppose an example that I've seen over time is of the build less, build clever part is using timber solutions, say on top of existing concrete car parks in cities, those kind of things. Existing footprint, using the benefits of lightweight timber framing solutions or timber solutions to provide housing, but reuse what we've already got in terms of footprint. So those kind of things make a fair bit of sense. Build efficiently and keep it longer. All great principles, and some harder than others to actually engage with. You're probably seeing I'm throwing a whole bunch of ideas up against the wall and using the steps towards a greener future as a sort of framework, but hopefully some of these might stick in people's mind. We're having the conversations around the table and we can get a few projects out of them, Benoit. Circular economy, end of life. I'm not going to steal Penny's thunder, but I will say that the definition of a circular economy is an economic system aimed at eliminating waste and continual use of resources. Circular systems deploy, reuse, repair, remake, and recycle to make a closed-loop system. So that's the idea. Some of the potential output solutions include minimise actual product use, implement design for construction principles, so reuse, use the most efficient processes to maximise product use, and then use any unavoidable waste as a feedstock for another process. So whenever we talk about circular economy, and Penny does it all the time, is we're not talking waste, we're talking products in many ways. So it's just, it may not be a valuable product yet, but it could be in the future. So let's try to scratch the word waste out of our vocabulary, I think. So things including other products like we saw particle board and also bioenergy as an output. Back to Rhianna's point earlier is carbon literacy, and the more you look at this area, the more it's pretty obvious that it's not a simple communication. Some of these ideas are quite complex. To be honest, how many times we as an industry have failed to simply convey ideas, facts that we know are true and we've got a passion for, but we haven't found the best way to get them into the supply chain or consumers, like sustainability as a notion, etc. So we really need to do a fair bit of work in carbon literacy as governments, industries and public are trying to understand what the bits of this complex topic is and how it might be achieved, the emissions reduction in our building industry. So there's a desperate need for higher level of literacy and understanding of the concepts and details. So just a few examples, and they've been outlined in the report as well, but FWPA, so Forest Wood Products Australia, has a ultimate renewable program, which I think it's a consumer-based program. It's a really good program. And there's a few carbon and net zero related publications like a carbon glossary and primer, Australia's carbon balance, the role of wood products in zero carbon buildings. So I think if we need to communicate those kind of things, we really need to grab these song sheets so that all of industry can grab and actually have the same discussion rather than different ones. Another initiative is right in front of me, it's glaring me in the face, is Kirsten's Carbon Warrior program, which advocates for Australian government policies and regulations promoting the use of renewable materials to assist the built environment, lower the impact on climate change. So exactly what we're talking about today. And it's been pretty popular, actually. Where can you get those shirts, Kirsten? You have to online. There you go. Any discounts in the near future? No. Good on you. Good stuff. All right. So that's carbon literacy. I know I'm probably going on a little bit. So the last one basically is valuing carbon. Biogenic carbon also remains stored in timber products. These are things we know for the life of the product, particularly valuable with rich buildings as they effectively become carbon storage units. So another carbon gain that we also know comes from the substitution effect of using wood in place of other more fossil fuel intensive materials. So a good example, it's probably not overly public, but FWPA with AFPA commissioned economic analysis by Indofor, another consultant, to assess the potential carbon abatement of utilising more wood solutions as opposed to alternatives like concrete and steel. And it was called the Greening Construction with Sustainable Wood Method proposal. Now, it goes back to what I said before, is that if you've got a passion for it, you like it, but you've got to have some commercial imperatives around it. Well, this is one, and they're carbon credits. So it's getting recognition for carbon credits for using timber-rich building solutions. and it was a really good piece of work, and it's been paused while I'm going to get it totally wrong, but it doesn't matter. Government body that looks at these method proposals are looking at a few other proposals at the moment. So I think it's on the shelf. It will be important. It was a good piece of work, and it'll have its day, to be honest. So we'll see what happens. And that will be an economic driver. All right, final slide, other reports. So obviously, we think this one's a good one, and it's actually utilises a fair bit of material from the Green Building Council Australia report, the very recent ASPEC report too, embodied carbon emissions in Australia's built environment. I recommend you go have a look at that one. And the previous one, which is important, as well as the CEFC, Australian Buildings and Infrastructure Opportunities for Cutting Embodied Carbon. So 3 reports, I'm sure there's more, but they're the ones I've read recently. And hopefully I've thrown enough stuff on the wall to catch some ideas out there. Thank you.